The sky above the Philippine Sea is a perfect, oppressive blue. It is June 19, 1944. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin and bitterly cold. Inside the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0, Petty Officer Iwo Nakamura tightens his grip on the control stick. The fabric of his flight suit is slick with sweat, not from heat, but from a tremoring exhaustion that has become his constant companion. His stomach, empty beyond the point of pain, is a tight knot. His last meal 8 hours ago was a single onigiri, a sparse ball of white rice wrapped in dried seaweed, the bland fuel of a fatting empire. Far below, the ocean is a vast, shimmering plain, and upon it, moving with a serene, terrifying purpose, is a sight that defies his reality. Not one, but a constellation of American aircraft carriers. The USS Lexington, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, they are not just warships. They are moving cities of steel, each trailing a faint, almost imperceptible haze of stacked gas and something else. A smell he cannot possibly detect at this altitude, yet one that will soon become a legend whispered in the shattered remains of his squadron's ready room. A story so absurd, so demeaning to the spirit of Yamato that it must be a lie. The Americans, they say, have machines that make ice cream. For Petty Officer Nakamura, banking his zero over that endless blue, the gulf between his reality and the floating citadels below was not merely one of distance or firepower. It was the result of a fundamental, irreconcilable collision of two philosophies of war. One was spiritual, valuing purity of spirit over material concern. The other was mechanistic, viewing war as a vast logistical equation to be solved by industrial mass and engineering precision. On one side stood Imperial Japan, a nation that had embarked on its campaign of conquest under the banner of Kodo, the Imperial Way. This ideology was deeply infused with the ancient samurai code of Bushido, which emphasized martial spirit, unquestioning loyalty, and an embrace of death in service to the emperor. In the distilled form preached to the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviators, it became Yamato Damasha, the Japanese spirit. This spirit was held to be unconquerable, a force that could overcome any material disadvantage. A pilot's worth was measured not in the comfort of his berth or the richness of his diet, but in the sharpness of his skill and the ferocity of his will. His aircraft, the legendary Zero, was the physical manifestation of this philosophy. Extraordinarily lightweight, long-ranged, and maneuverable, but fragile, lacking self-sealing fuel tanks or pilot armor, sacrifices made for performance, mirroring the expected sacrifices of the man who flew it. This cultural focus on the spiritual over the material dovetailed with a stark industrial reality. Japan was a resource-poor island nation. Its war economy, though formidable in its own right and capable of producing superb weapons, operated on a knife's edge. Every ton of steel, every gallon of aviation fuel, every ounce of aluminum was a precious commodity to be allocated with ruthless priority to frontline combat systems. The concept of diverting resources to what were deemed luxuries or excessive crew comforts was not just impractical, it was philosophically alien. Sustenance for sailors and airmen was functional: rice, miso, pickled plums, umeboshi, and dried fish. It was designed to be compact, storable, and nutritionally adequate barely. The iconic onigiri, the rice ball, was its perfect symbol. Simple, portable, and born of scarcity. Against this stood the United States, the arsenal of democracy. Its philosophy of war was not born of ancient code, but of modern industrial theory. It viewed conflict through the lens of men, material, and logistics. The American military-industrial complex was not just about building more weapons, it was about building a self-sustaining ecosystem of war. This ethos was encapsulated in the figure of Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable chief of naval operations, and his subordinate Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. They were not mystics, they were managers of violence on an oceanic scale. They understood that to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific, they needed not just ships but mobile, resilient bases that could maintain the fighting efficiency of their crews over months at sea, far from any friendly port. This understanding gave birth to the Essex-class fast aircraft carrier, the definitive weapon of the Pacific War's latter half. These were not just flat tops, they were floating industrial nodes. Each one, over 880 feet long and displacing over 36,000 tons, was a masterpiece of integrated design. They contained machine shops that could repair aircraft engines, foundries that could cast replacement parts, vast hangar decks that served as airborne assembly lines, and storage for thousands of tons of munitions and aviation fuel. They were designed for endurance and crew sustainability. And within this ecosystem of steel and high explosives, American naval planners made a conscious, calculated decision to include mechanisms for morale. The ice cream machine was not a frivolous afterthought. It was a tiny, telling component in a vast logistical machine. Fresh food was a priority, with massive refrigerated stores and even bakeries aboard. The soda fountain and the ice cream parlor were seen as legitimate tools of war. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery had published studies linking morale to diet. In a service where men faced the terror of kamikaze attacks, the mind-numbing boredom of weeks at sea, and the relentless pressure of combat operations, a taste of home, a chocolate sundae, a cold milkshake was considered a tangible force multiplier. It was a small piece of normalcy in an abyss of chaos, a reminder of what they were fighting for and a psychological bulwark against exhaustion. It represented a culture that believed to sustain the fighting spirit, one must also sustain the body and the mind. Thus, by the time of the great carrier clashes in the Marianas, two fleets were on a collision course, each the product of its nation's soul. One fleet sailed on willpower and rice, its pilots honed to a razor's edge but physically diminishing. The other steamed on diesel fuel and dairy, its crews supported by an oceanic pipeline of supply that delivered everything from 16-inch shells to vanilla flavoring. This was the deep structural backdrop to the moment a Japanese pilot, dizzy with hunger, looked down at an American task force and heard a rumor he could scarcely believe. This clash of philosophies was not an abstract divide. It was rendered in steel, blood, and tactical doctrine across the immense theater of the Pacific. The war had evolved into a brutal contest of reach and endurance, where the ability to project air power thousands of miles from one's homeland was paramount. For Japan, this was the domain of the Kaido Butte, the Mobile fleet, whose stunning victory at Pearl Harbor had been predicated on audacity, secrecy, and the exceptional range of its aircraft. Their strategic concept, Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle, envisioned luring the American fleet into a final annihilating engagement near Japanese home waters, where shore-based air power and submarines could whittle down the enemy before the Imperial Navy's battle line delivered the coup de grace. This doctrine placed a premium on the qualitative edge of individual weapons and the warrior spirit of their operators. Logistics were a secondary concern, a matter of topping off tanks before the sprint to battle. The fleet train of tankers and supply ships for the Imperial Navy was always anemic, a vulnerable tail to the combatant teeth. The United States Navy, recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, adopted a different approach, forged in the crucible of necessity. It was a strategy of relentless hopping advance Christian island hopping. Spearheaded by the fast carrier task forces, this involved seizing key islands, bypassing strongholds to let them wither on the vine, and using each captured atoll as a forward airfield and anchorage to extend the reach of the next leap. This was a war of infrastructure. Every advance required not just combat victory, but the immediate construction of ports, airstrips, fuel depots, and hospitals. The fleet that supported these advances, Task Force 38 under Admiral William F. Halsey, or Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, was a self-contained universe. It was centered on the Essex-class carriers, protected by a screen of fast battleships, cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers, the famed picket line. But its true strength lay in its train, the fleet oilers, ammunition ships, provision ships, and escort carriers dedicated to replenishment. Under a system called the Underway Replenishment Group, American warships could refuel, rearm, and resupply without ever returning to a distant base like Pearl Harbor. They could remain on the front lines for months. This logistical artery pumped lifeblood into the task force. Fresh lettuce, eggs, and meat were transferred via highline alongside bombs and bullets. Mail from home was delivered. And crucially, the ingredients for comfort, soda, syrup, coffee, and the mix for ice cream, flowed steadily from the auxiliary ships to the carriers and their screening vessels. The ice cream itself became a currency and a ritual. On smaller ships like destroyers and submarines, which lacked the elaborate machinery of the carriers, resourceful sailors devised their own methods. They would secure a 5-gallon can of the mix to a deck gun or the engine manifold of a torpedo, using the weapon's recoil or the engine's heat to churn it. On carriers, the machines, often surplus aircraft engine starters repurposed to turn the freezing drums, ran almost constantly. The wardroom might have Sundays, the enlisted mess lines would dish out cups of the cold treat. It was a systemic, institutionalized allowance for a basic human pleasure. For the Japanese sailor and airman, the war was a journey into progressive deprivation. The early triumphs of 1941-42 masked a fatal fragility in their supply lines. As the U.S. submarine campaign, orchestrated by Admiral Charles A. Lockwood's Pacific Fleet Submarine Force, tightened its noose around the Japanese home islands, the flow of vital resources began to dry up. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies were sent to the bottom. Freighters laden with rice from occupied Southeast Asia vanished. By 1944, the situation was critical. Fuel was rationed to the point that fleet operations were severely constrained, and pilot training was slashed to conserve aviation gasoline and aircraft. Aboard ships, rice rations were cut and the onigiri became smaller, often made with lower quality musty grain. Fresh vegetables and fruit vanished, leading to outbreaks of vitamin deficiency diseases like beriberi and scurvy among crews who had once been among the best fed in the world. The concept of gammon, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity, was invoked not just for combat, but for the slow, grinding starvation that was becoming routine. The stage was thus set for a confrontation that would test these two systems to their breaking point. The American thrust into the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, in the summer of 1944 presented Japan with the crisis it had long feared. The fall of these islands would place the new, long-range B-29 superfortress within striking distance of the Japanese homeland itself. For Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, this triggered the long-awaited opportunity for the Kantai-Kessen, Operation Ago. He would commit the bulk of the Imperial Navy's remaining strength, including 9 carriers under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, to smash the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance. Ozawa's plan was tactically ingenious but logistically desperate. He would use the longer range of his aircraft, a product of that same weight-saving philosophy that birthed the Zero, to strike the American fleet from beyond the range of its own planes, using the islands as unsinkable bases for refueling and rearming. It was a plan born of material weakness, reliant on the skill of pilots who were now, due to the fuel crisis, a shadow of the elite force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They were young, poorly trained, and physically weakened. They would fly to battle on empty stomachs, while their adversaries waited for them, well-fed, rested, and psychologically fortified by a system that understood sustenance in its broadest sense. The two fleets converged in the Philippine Sea, one propelled by the last gasp of a dwindling spirit, the other by the relentless, well-oiled machinery of industrial war. War is fought by machines, but it is endured by men. The psychological landscape of the Pacific sailor and aviator was one of extreme duality, long stretches of paralyzing monotony shattered by moments of absolute terror. How each navy addressed this reality speaks volumes. For the U.S. Navy, the well-being of the crew was a calculable asset, a component of combat efficiency. Fresh food, regular mail call, movie nights on the hangar deck, and yes, ice cream were not mere perks, they were tools of personnel management. Naval psychiatrists of the era understood the corrosive effects of low morale on vigilance, decision-making, and unit cohesion. A treat like ice cream served multiple functions. It was a tangible reward after the stress of flight operations or general quarters. It was a sensory connection to home, a taste of a normal life that felt a million miles away. In the crowded, metallic, fuel-scented world of a warship, it was a moment of simple, shared pleasure that cut across rank. The line for ice cream was a great equalizer. This conscious cultivation of resilience had a direct impact on combat performance. A pilot returning from a long, stressful mission over hostile waters could decompress with a cup of coffee and a sundae, discussing the engagement with his squadron mates in a space that felt, however briefly, civilized. The physical caloric intake was secondary to the psychological recharge. It reinforced a sense of being valued, of being supported by an immense system that cared for its own. This fostered a mindset of endurance of the long haul. The war was a job to be done, and the Navy, in providing these comforts, was signaling that it would do its part to help its men do that job. For the Japanese sailor and aviator, the psychological burden was of a different order. The code of Bushido and the state ideology of Kokutai placed the highest value on self-abnegation and sacrifice for the emperor. Comfort was a distraction from spiritual purity, hardship was a forge for the warrior spirit. Endurance was not just expected, it was celebrated. This created a culture where complaining about conditions, poor food, cramped quarters, lack of amenities was seen as weakness, a failure of spirit. Morale was thus supposed to be internally generated, a fire stoked by ideology alone. But human physiology has limits that ideology cannot breach. As the war progressed and rations dwindled, the physical decline of Japanese crews became a tactical liability. Malnutrition led to chronic fatigue, slowed reaction times, and impaired night vision. Vitamin deficiencies caused neurological issues. A pilot suffering from beriberi, his legs swollen and numb, was at a severe disadvantage in a dogfight. The constant, gnawing hunger became a mental preoccupation, crowding out tactical focus. The onigiri, once a symbol of simple sustenance, became a mocking reminder of scarcity. Where the American sailor saw the ice cream machine as proof of a system that sustained him, the Japanese sailor saw his shrinking rice ball as evidence of a system that was consuming him. The contrast was not just in the palate, it was in the message it sent. One navy was fueling its men for a marathon, the other was burning its men out in a sprint. This fundamental difference in the philosophy of human capital would be tested in the furnace of combat, where stamina, clarity, and the will to fight another day would prove as decisive as the number of guns on a ship. The ability to produce and serve ice cream at sea was a trivial offshoot of a monumental engineering achievement. The Essex-class aircraft carrier represented the zenith of American wartime production and design philosophy, overwhelming functional capability married to robust survivability. Each ship was a masterpiece of integrated systems, a floating testament to the belief that every component, from the armor belt to the galley, contributed to the vessel's fighting purpose. The design priorities were clear: speed over 33 knots to keep pace with the fast carrier task force and outrun threats, armor a carefully designed box protecting hangar deck edges, magazines, and engineering spaces, and most critically offensive and defensive air power. With a complement of over 90 aircraft, an Essex-class carrier could launch devastating strikes while maintaining a robust combat air patrol. But to keep this airborne fist operational thousands of miles from port required an internal ecosystem of support. Vast hangar decks, served by 2 centerline elevators and 1 deck-edge elevator, allowed for rapid rearming and repair. Machine shops could rebuild aircraft engines. Carpenter shops could fabricate damaged fuselage sections. The ship carried enough aviation gasoline to fill the tanks of its air group multiple times over, stored in sophisticated, inert gas-flushed tanks to minimize fire risk. It was within this labyrinth of workshops, ordnance magazines, and crew quarters that the support systems for the crew were woven. Massive evaporators turned seawater into fresh water for boilers, for drinking, and for showers. Industrial-scale galleys and bakeries fed thousands of men 3 hot meals a day. Refrigeration plants of a size previously unseen on warships kept thousands of pounds of meat, dairy, and vegetables fresh for weeks. And it was these same refrigeration plants that powered the ice cream machines. The machinery was often ad hoc, a surplus electric motor from a gun turret trainer, a repurposed mixing drum, but it was enabled by the ship's abundant electrical power and fresh water. The ice cream was a byproduct of an engineering philosophy that left nothing to chance. If you could provide fresh food, you should. If you could boost morale with a treat, you must. It was all part of maintaining the machine that was the crew. Contrast this with the evolution of Japanese carrier design. The masterpiece of the early war, Akagi, a converted battlecruiser, and Kaga, a converted battleship, were large and carried a formidable air group. But they were also vulnerable, a lesson learned brutally at Midway. Subsequent Japanese carriers, like the purpose-built Shikaku class, were excellent ships, fast and durable. However, the focus remained almost exclusively on the offensive arm. Crew accommodations were stark and cramped. Damage control equipment and training were tragically inadequate compared to the U.S. Navy's relentless drills. And critically, the concept of the ship as a self-sustaining logistical hub was underdeveloped. While Japanese carriers had galleys, the scale and variety of provisioning were not prioritized. The fleet train was thin and resupply at sea was primitive. A Japanese carrier's endurance was limited not just by its fuel bunkerage, but by the amount of dry rice and pickles it could physically store in its holds. There was no excess capacity, no engineering bandwidth for what was deemed non-essential. The ship was a weapon to be used decisively, not a home to be endured in for months. This engineering divergence meant that as operations lengthened, the American carrier's combat efficiency could be maintained, while the Japanese carrier, along with the physical state of its crew, degraded. The ice cream machine was, therefore, the tip of a vast industrial iceberg, a small, sweet symbol of a massive, coldly rational capability to sustain a war of attrition. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, the austerity endured by its sailors and airmen was not perceived as a failing but as a virtue. It was the physical manifestation of Yamato Damasha. To suffer hunger, fatigue, and discomfort without complaint was to prove one's purity of purpose, to shed the soft materialism that was believed to infect Western militaries. This cultural stoicism was double-edged. It produced forces capable of incredible feats of endurance and desperation, from the long-range raid on Pearl Harbor to the frenzied Banzai charge. But it also blinded the high command to a brutal strategic reality. Willpower is a non-renewable resource when the body is systematically consumed. The Japanese military ethos celebrated the aesthetic of scarcity. The pilot's simple meals, the sailor's Spartan quarters, were seen as refining fires. This thinking extended to strategy. The entire Kantai-Kessen doctrine was a gamble on a short, decisive war, a samurai duel on an oceanic scale. It had no serious logistical component for a protracted conflict. The assumption was that material disadvantages would be overcome by superior fighting spirit in the climactic battle. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. When the U.S. Navy refused to be lured into a trap and instead began its methodical, grinding advance across the Central and South Pacific, Japan was forced into a war of attrition for which it was ideologically and industrially unprepared. The reverence for sacrifice then became a tool to mask this failure. As supplies dwindled, the shrinking rice ration was framed not as a logistical collapse, but as a shared hardship that would strengthen collective resolve. When pilots' training hours were cut from hundreds to mere dozens due to fuel shortages, it was rationalized that their innate spirit and the superior maneuverability of the Zero would compensate for their lack of skill. The system began to demand the ultimate sacrifice to compensate for its own material bankruptcy. The emergence of the Takutai, the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, in late 1944 was the logical, horrifying endpoint of this philosophy. If a pilot with limited training could not achieve victory through skill, he could achieve it through the purity of his will, transforming his aircraft and his body into the weapon the industry could no longer produce in sufficient quantity or quality. This created a devastating feedback loop. The worse the material situation became, the more the ideology of spirit over matter was intensified to justify the deprivation. To admit that ice cream, or more critically, adequate calories, vitamins, fuel, and trained pilots, mattered would have been to admit the failure of the foundational myth of Japanese martial superiority. Thus, the rumor of American ice cream machines was not just unbelievable because it was extravagant, it was psychologically threatening. It represented a winning formula that was the antithesis of their own suffering. If the enemy could wage war in comfort, then their own agony was not a noble sacrifice but a pointless misery imposed by a failing system. The ice cream rumor, therefore, struck at the very heart of the Japanese warrior's identity, suggesting that the Americans had found a way to fight effectively without first breaking the human spirit through deprivation. The Japanese term senshin, to advance fighting spirit, encapsulated the belief that morale could fill material gaps. But by 1944, the material gap had become an unbridgeable chasm and spirit was bleeding out through it. The logistical war, a conflict fought in shipping lanes by submarines and in planning rooms by quartermasters, had reached its tipping point. This was not a front line visible on a map, but it determined everything that happened on those maps. The American strategy was one of systematic strangulation. The U.S. submarine force, finally equipped with reliable torpedoes, waged a ruthless and effective campaign against the Japanese merchant marine, the nation's economic lifeline. Tankers carrying crude oil from the East Indies were primary targets. By mid-1944, Japan's oil reserves were critically low, dictating every major naval operation. The fleet could only sail if the operation was deemed decisive, and even then with strict fuel rationing. This directly impacted pilot training. Where a U.S. Navy aviator might log 300 hours before joining a carrier squadron, a late-war Japanese replacement pilot was lucky to receive 80, often on obsolete aircraft. They were taught to take off land and little else. The intricate art of dogfighting, carrier landing in rough weather, and navigation over open ocean was lost. They were bodies to fill cockpits, their spirits untempered by skill. Simultaneously, the Allied advance severed Japan's access to key food-producing regions. Rice imports from Burma and Thailand dwindled as shipping was sunk. Onboard Japanese warships, the diet regressed. The once adequate rations of rice, fish, and pickled vegetables gave way to monotony and scarcity. Rice was often mixed with barley or millet to stretch it. Fresh produce vanished. The resulting malnutrition was clinical and debilitating. Beriberi, caused by thiamine vitamin B1 deficiency, led to fatigue, weakness, and nerve damage. Scurvy from a lack of vitamin C caused bleeding gums and poor wound healing. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency crippled a pilot's effectiveness in dawn or dusk operations. The Japanese sailor or airman was not just hungry, he was physically deteriorating, a machine running on contaminated fuel. Meanwhile, the U.S. logistical pipeline achieved a staggering efficiency. The Service Force Pacific Fleet operated a steel highway of tankers, ammunition ships, and provision ships that rendezvoused with the fast carrier task forces at prearranged points. Underway replenishment, refueling, rearming, and restocking became a perfected ballet of seamanship. A destroyer could pull alongside a fleet oiler, receive hundreds of tons of fuel, and be back on station in an hour. Carriers took on not just bombs and aviation gas, but pallets of fresh fruit, frozen meat, and the ingredients for bread and pastries. This system meant Task Force 58 could maintain a continuous presence off enemy shores for months, its combat power undiminished, its crews sustained. The ice cream was the ultimate symbol of this logistical excess. It was a luxury that could only exist at the end of a vast, secure, and resilient supply chain. It required surplus fresh milk and sugar, dedicated refrigeration, and the electrical power to run the machines, all resources that Japan was directing desperately toward bullets and gasoline. For the U.S. Navy, the luxury was sustainable. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, even the necessities were running out. The war had reached a point where one side was worrying about dessert, while the other was dying from a lack of staples. This was the hardened reality behind the rumor. The Americans weren't just winning battles, they had won the war of supply long before the final shots were fired. The onigiri was no longer just a meal, it was the dwindling currency of a bankrupt system, while the ice cream sundae was the dividend of a system operating at a staggering surplus. The great clash that would crystallize this disparity, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, opened not with a roar but with an electronic whisper. Dawn on June 19, 1944 found Task Force 58 arrayed in its defensive might west of the Marianas. Aboard the flagship USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher and his staff monitored a growing cacophony of bogey reports from radar picket destroyers far to the west. The long-awaited Japanese counterstroke, Operation Eigo, was unfolding. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa from his flagship Teiho had launched the first of 4 massive aerial raids. He held the theoretical advantage. His aircraft had a longer operational range, allowing him to strike from over 300 miles away, outside the effective range of most American fighters. His plan was to shuttle his planes between the carriers and the airfields on Guam and Rota, hitting the American fleet in successive waves. It was a clever plan on paper, fatally flawed in reality. The flaw was that the Americans could see it coming. The U.S. Navy's Combat Information Centers, CICs, with their advanced radar suites and improved radio coordination, transformed the vastness of the ocean into a manageable tactical grid. Ozawa's first raid of 69 aircraft was detected over 150 miles out. This granted Mitcher's fighters time to vector, to gain altitude, and to choose their moment. Aboard the carriers, the condition of the American pilots stood in stark contrast to what was coming. They were rested. They had eaten a hot breakfast. Their F-6F Hellcats, rugged and powerful, were fueled and armed by well-drilled deck crews. Many pilots had already been flying Combat Air Patrol CAP for hours, cycled through in shifts that allowed for rest and food. There was no tremor of hunger in their hands, only the focused anticipation of hunters. As the Japanese formation, a mix of Zeros, dive bomber Vals, and torpedo bomber Kates, droned toward the fleet, they were met not over the task force but miles out by stacked formations of Hellcats. What followed was less a dogfight and more a systematic dismantling. The inexperienced Japanese pilots, many on their first combat mission, flying aircraft that were now outclassed by the heavier Hellcat, were utterly outmatched. The American pilots, veteran and well-trained, exploited every advantage. Radio chatter was calm, professional. Tally-ho, bogeys at 10 o'clock high. Got one smoking. Break left, break left. The Zero's legendary maneuverability was negated by the American tactic of the thatch weave and the Hellcat's ability to dive away and regain energy. Dozens of Japanese planes were slashed from the sky in minutes, falling in flaming spirals that the American pilots grimly called flamers. Only a handful of panicked attackers reached the task force, and their efforts were largely futile, stopped by a furious curtain of anti-aircraft fire from the tightly screened fleet. Back on the Japanese carriers, the first reports were catastrophic. Radio operators listened to the frantic fatting transmissions of their aviators. Then a far greater disaster struck. The new armored carrier Teiho, Ozawa's pride, had been struck by a single torpedo from the American submarine USS Albacore hours earlier. A minor hit but damage control errors, a failure to properly ventilate fumes from leaking aviation fuel, had turned the ship into a floating bomb. At 3:30 p.m., a massive internal explosion ripped Teiho apart, sending her to the bottom with hundreds of crewmen and a large portion of the fleet's operational headquarters. Just hours before, the veteran carrier Shikaku had also been torpedoed by USS Kavala and succumbed to almost identical damage control failures. In a single day, Ozawa had lost 2 of his 3 largest carriers not to surface battle, but to submarines, the very weapons of the logistical war, and seen the bulk of his first strike annihilated without inflicting a single significant hit on the American fleet. Yet bound by doctrine and desperation, Ozawa launched his second, third, and fourth waves. The result was a grim repetition. Each raid was detected early, intercepted far out, and butchered. The American pilots returning to their carriers low on fuel and ammunition would find a well-oiled machine waiting for them. Deck crews swarmed their aircraft, refueling and rearming with practiced speed. The pilots themselves would debrief, then often head to the wardroom or mess deck. The contrast was now visceral. As one American aviator from USS Enterprise later recalled, after landing from a sortie where he had shot down 2 Japanese planes, he went straight to the ship's soda fountain for an ice-cold milk shake. The physical refreshment was part of the combat cycle. As he drank, he could look out at the deck, already being prepared for the next launch, while on the horizon the smoke of dying Japanese aircraft still smudged the sky. The system was not just defeating the enemy, it was doing so without breaking its own rhythm, sustaining its human components as effectively as it did its mechanical ones. The day of June 19, 1944 would later be immortalized by an American pilot who, upon returning to his carrier, famously exclaimed, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But it was not merely a story of aerial superiority. It was the live-fire demonstration of a complete systemic victory. One side operated with integrated efficiency, from radar screen to refueling hose to ice cream machine. The other side was disintegrating in real time. Its plans shattered, its finest ships lost to simple errors, its young pilots, many of whom had taken off with empty stomachs and hearts full of doomed conviction, being erased from the sky in scores. The battle's decisive turn, however, was not yet complete. The greatest demonstration of the American system's depth and the final, crushing blow to the Japanese spirit would come with the setting of the sun. As dusk settled over the Philippine Sea on June 19, Admiral Raymond Spruance, the cautious and calculating commander of the Fifth Fleet, had achieved his primary objective. The invasion beaches on Saipan were secure from naval threat. The Japanese carrier air groups had been virtually obliterated at a cost of only 29 American aircraft lost in combat. But for Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, the job was unfinished. The enemy's carrier force, though bled white of its planes, was still afloat and retreating westward. Letting it escape to fight another day was anathema to the aggressive carrier commander. Throughout the night, American PBY Catalina patrol bombers and radar-equipped Avengers tracked Ozawa's fleeing fleet. The contact reports were intermittent, the distance great, but Mitcher prepared a gamble born of confidence in his men and his machines. At dawn on June 20, search planes finally fixed Ozawa's location. He was over 300 miles away at the absolute extreme limit of American aircraft range. A strike launch now meant a return flight after dark, a perilous endeavor for exhausted pilots landing on pitching decks. For Spruance, the risk was considerable. For Mitcher, it was the necessary kill. Permission was granted. Across the task force, deck crews, who had been operating at a frenetic pace for over 24 hours, began the monumental task of arming and fueling 216 aircraft for a maximum range strike. The pilots, briefed on the long flight, prepared themselves. Here, the American system's focus on sustenance showed its tactical value. Before the launch, air crews were given a hot meal. Thermos bottles of coffee were stowed in cockpits. This was not coddling, it was fuel for a marathon mission that would test physical and mental endurance to its limit. The strike launched late in the afternoon at 4:21 p.m. For the aviators, the long flight westward was a tense, fuel-conscious cruise. They found Ozawa's force just before sunset. What followed was a frantic, chaotic attack in the gathering gloom. The Japanese combat air patrol was negligible. American dive bombers and torpedo planes pressed home attacks against carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda. They scored hits, setting fires and causing damage, though only one carrier, Hiyo, was sunk outright. More Japanese auxiliaries and a tanker were sent to the bottom. But as the Americans broke off and turned east into the now full darkness, they faced their own crisis. They were low on fuel, navigating by dead reckoning over a featureless ocean toward a blacked-out task force that dared not show a light. This was the moment where the human element, supported by the system, faced its ultimate test. Back on Task Force 58, Mitcher made a command decision that passed into naval legend. Despite the risk of submarine attack, he ordered, "Turn on the lights." Every ship in the task force illuminated its deck lights, searchlights pointed vertically into the sky, and starshells were fired to create a beacon visible for miles. It was a glaring invitation to any enemy submarine, but it was a lifeline to his returning airmen. One by one, stricken, fuel-starved aircraft began to appear out of the darkness. The ensuing recovery was a controlled disaster. Planes splashed into the sea after engine failure. Others crashed onto decks in desperate hard landings. Flight decks became chaotic junkyards of damaged aircraft as pilots, their physical reserves spent from the long, harrowing mission, put their planes down any way they could. Yet the system absorbed the blow. Destroyers immediately peeled off to rescue pilots from the water, a stark contrast to the Japanese, who often left their downed aviators to their fate. Deck crews worked with frantic efficiency under the glaring lights to clear wreckage and land more planes. Medical teams were ready. And for those pilots who made it safely below decks, the familiar comforts awaited. The galleys remained open, serving hot food and coffee to men whose hands were still shaking from adrenaline and fatigue. The ice cream machines symbolically kept churning. The ordeal of the night recovery cost the U.S. Navy over 80 aircraft ditched or crashed due to fuel exhaustion and pilot error, a heavier loss than the combat of the previous day. But of the 209 aircrew who had launched that afternoon, 166 were rescued. The human capital was preserved. For Ozawa's fleet, slinking away in the darkness, the physical and psychological damage was terminal. His carrier decks, which had launched over 430 aircraft in the battle, were now virtually empty. Only 35 operational aircraft remained to the entire Mobile fleet. The elite air groups of the Imperial Navy, painstakingly built over years and now irreplaceable due to the fuel and training crisis, had been exterminated in 2 days. The carriers that survived were mere hollow hulls, their striking power gone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. The material disparity had been converted into a decisive, irreversible military victory. The American system had proven it could project power at extreme range, absorb a self-inflicted operational crisis, and recover its most valuable assets, its trained pilots. The Japanese system had proven it could expend its last irreplaceable resources in a gesture of ultimate, and ultimately futile, sacrifice. The turning point was not just a tactical victory. It was the moment the war became truly irreversible, proven not only in the sinking of ships but in the saving of men, and in the cups of ice cream served to those men in the quiet, triumphant hours after the storm. In the cold arithmetic of war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. The raw statistics tell a story of near-total eradication. Over the 2 days of major combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 480 carrier-based aircraft and an additional 200 land-based aircraft from Guam and Rota, totaling around 680 planes. Of the hundreds of aviators sent into the fray, fewer than 100 survived. These were not just aircraft, they were the last collective repository of experienced pilots Japan possessed. The human capital of its naval air arm was liquidated. In tangible losses, the Japanese suffered 3 aircraft carriers sunk, the new Teiho, the veteran Shikaku, and the light carrier Hio, along with 2 fleet oilers critically damaged. The U.S. Navy's losses, by comparison, were shockingly light. 123 aircraft, most of those lost in the night recovery on June 20 and damage to 1 battleship, the USS South Dakota, from a single bomb hit. But the numbers only capture the immediate wreckage. The deeper consequence was strategic bankruptcy. Operation Ago, envisioned as the decisive Kantai-Kessen, had resulted in the decisive defeat of Japanese carrier aviation. The surviving carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, Chiyoda, Chitos, Ryuho returned to home waters as empty shells. Lacking both aircraft and, more importantly, the trained aircrews to fly them, they would never again operate as a conventional strike force. The centerpiece of Japanese naval power for the first half of the Pacific War had been rendered obsolete in 48 hours. The defeat guaranteed the fall of the Marianas. With the Imperial Navy broken, the U.S. ground forces on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian could not be dislodged. By August, all 3 islands were in American hands, and engineers were already bulldozing airfields for the B-29 superfortress. The Japanese homeland was now within reach of sustained, heavy bombing. The inner defense perimeter had been shattered. For the American sailor and pilot, the aftermath was one of grim satisfaction and sober reflection. The Turkey shoot confirmed the supremacy of their technology, training, and tactics. The F-6F Hellcat was now undisputed master of the Pacific sky. The efficacy of radar-directed combat air patrol and the strength of the task force's anti-aircraft screen had been proven beyond doubt. But the harrowing night recovery of June 20 also provided a profound lesson in the limits of even the most robust system. It sparked immediate revisions to pilot rescue procedures, radio protocols, and carrier landing techniques for exhausted aircrew. The system's strength was its capacity for learning and adaptation. While they celebrated victory, they also studied the near catastrophe to become more resilient. For the Japanese, the aftermath was a void, filled with silence and shame. The scale of the defeat was so comprehensive that the Imperial Japanese Navy initially concealed its true extent even from the army and the government. The carrier Teiho's sinking was kept secret for months. There were no triumphant returns to port, no stirring accounts of glorious sacrifice, only the quiet arrival of battered ships carrying hollow-eyed survivors. The rumor that had once seemed so absurd, of American ice cream machines, now carried the weight of a terrifying epiphany. It was no longer a joke about softness but a stark metric of a terrifying capability. If the enemy could afford such extravagance at the very tip of its spear, thousands of miles from home, what unimaginable abundance must exist at its base? The onigiri, the symbol of shared hardship, now symbolized a shared doom. The spiritual fortress of Yamato Damasha had been breached not by a superior spirit, but by a relentless, grinding, well-fed machine that could produce both Hellcats and hot fudge sundaes with equal indifference. The material gap had become an abyss, and into it had fallen the last hope for a negotiated end to the war. The defeat in the Philippine Sea did not just lose a battle, it accelerated the Japanese Empire's descent into a grim terminal phase. The loss of the Marianas triggered a political earthquake in Tokyo. On July 18, 1944, Prime Minister Heike Tojo and his entire cabinet were forced to resign. The nation's leadership, which had staked its credibility on victory, now had to confront the inevitability of defeat. The strategic initiative passed completely and irrevocably to the United States. American forces, their logistical tail growing stronger with each captured anchorage, now had a range of options: north toward Iwo Jima and the direct air route to Japan, west to the Philippines to cut off the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, or both simultaneously. The Japanese military, its carrier fist shattered, could only react. What remained of Japanese naval air power underwent a grotesque metamorphosis. With trained pilots extinct and fuel for proper flight training almost gone, the concept of the Taketai, the special attack units, transitioned from a desperate idea to standard doctrine. If a novice pilot could not master aerial combat, he could be taught to take off, point his aircraft at a ship, and dive. The kamikaze, born later in 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the direct, logical offspring of the Philippine Sea disaster. It was warfare stripped of all technique, relying solely on the will to die. This shift further devalued the individual pilot, transforming him from a warrior into a guided munition, the ultimate tragic consumption of human spirit to compensate for material bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the American industrial and logistical machine hit a staggering stride. The pipeline of Essex-class and light Independence-class carriers swelled. By late 1944, Task Force 3858 could routinely sortie with over a dozen fast carriers, a display of power that was unimaginable to the surviving Japanese commanders. The fleet train grew into an armada of its own. Underway replenishment groups, now including CVE escort carriers dedicated solely to ferrying replacement aircraft, allowed the fast carrier task forces to remain on the line almost indefinitely. The ice cream machine was no longer an anecdote, it was standard equipment. Even smaller ships like destroyers, through ingenuity and the bounty of the supply chain, found ways to make their own. The luxury had become routine, a testament to a war economy operating at a level of plenty that Japan could no longer even comprehend. On the Japanese home front and across the shrinking empire, the material noose tightened. American submarines, now joined by strategic bombers from the Marianas, systematically dismantled what remained of Japanese shipping and industrial capacity. Rice riots erupted in cities as food distribution collapsed. The military's rations grew even more meager. For the ordinary Japanese soldier and sailor, the war became an exercise in bare survival, a constant grinding hunger. Beriberi and scurvy were rampant. The once proud Imperial Navy, unable to sortie for lack of fuel, saw many of its great warships, including the surviving carriers from the Philippine Sea, languish in port as static anti-aircraft batteries, only to be sunk at anchor by U.S. carrier aircraft in 1945. The system that had chosen to invest solely in the spearhead, neglecting the shaft and the arm that wielded it, now found itself disarmed and starving. The contrast between the two fleets in the final year of the war was now absolute and visible. American task forces operated with a bustling, weary normalcy, launching strikes, painting ships, showing movies, serving meals. Japanese forces, whether on bypassed islands or in the home islands, subsisted in a state of deepening privation, awaiting an apocalyptic final battle. The rumor of the ice cream machine had been a curiosity, then a shock, and finally a symbol of a crushing truth. The Americans had not just won the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they had validated a complete theory of modern industrial warfare, where logistics, technology, and human sustainability were inseparable components of victory. Japan's theory of war, the decisive battle won by spiritual fervor, lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Along with its aircraft and the hopes of its pilots, who had gone into battle with rice balls in their pockets and found on the other side of the sky an enemy who had just finished dessert. In the end, the story of the ice cream machine and the rice ball is not a trivial anecdote about comparative luxuries. It is a parable of modern war. The Pacific conflict, vast and oceanic in scale, was ultimately a contest of systems, of production, of supply, of sustainability. The ice cream machine was the polished tip of a vast, submerged iceberg of American industrial might and logistical genius. It represented a philosophy that understood war as a total endeavor requiring the maintenance of the human spirit as diligently as the maintenance of aircraft engines. It was cold, hard, creamy proof that the United States could project not just power, but a slice of normalcy to the farthest reaches of the globe, and in doing so fortify its men for the long, grim task ahead. The onigiri, conversely, was the stark emblem of a system that revered sacrifice but failed to sustain the sacrificer. It reflected a culture that believed the purity of motive could transcend physical need, a fatal romanticism in a war of factories and shipping lanes. The empty stomach of the Japanese pilot was not just a personal hardship, it was a symptom of a strategic disease, a fatal disconnect between the empire's ambitions and its material capacity to fuel them. His hunger was as much a weapon used against him as the Hellcat's .50 caliber bullets. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, therefore, stands as one of history's most definitive demonstrations of material reality over ideological fervor. It was the point at which disparity became doom. The American victory was forged in steel mills on assembly lines, in the minds of operational planners, and in the galleys of fleet oilers. It was a victory ensured not only by the courage of the pilot in the cockpit, but by the ingenuity of the cook in the galley and the quartermaster on the supply ship. The war would continue for another brutal year, but its outcome was sealed in those June skis. The lesson was as clear as it was unforgiving. In the industrial age, the side that better fuels its men in every sense of the word, ultimately fuels its victory. The ice cream in its small, sweet way was as decisive as the bomb.